Watch out, Susan. The Ratmen appear to be coming under the underground tunnels. It's like, nothing that we can't handle, Carol. Come on, let's play exterminator.
Oh no! What is that?
Hello there, I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the Fourth Wall, and don't you judge me. Today, we're going to be talking about, should you use minis? The debate on whether or not you should use minis in your role-playing game actually stretches back all the way to the very first instance of role-playing. Not a lot of people know that the very first role-playing games actually came out of strategy games. Miniature war games. Well, the people who sat down and played those games, they decided they wanted, their generals and heroes in their groups to either go on adventures or at least to talk to one another and maybe do some diplomacy and stuff. And that's where the first role playing came from. So minis and role playing kind of go hand in hand, and it comes all the way back from that time period. However, at the same time, there's lots of pros and cons to whether or not to use minis, and multiple considerations for game masters whether or not they should use them. The first is really what game you're running, because there are games out there that are designed around the use of minis, such as Mechton Zeta, the Hero System, or even Dungeons & Dragons 4th Edition. Those are games that when they were designed, they were really designed around the idea that players were going to be using minis to represent their characters. And combat is really built around that. Now, that's not to say that you can't run those systems without using minis. By no means. It just requires a little more legwork from the player or the game master, because they got to rework the system to make it work to be more cinematic, as Mechton Zeta puts it. Now, another consideration, especially let's take Mechton Zeta, is on top of that being a game where its combat and everything is really built around using minis. Conceptually, it's hard to run that without minis because of the sense of scale. That's a mech game where a basic unit of space is a single hex, and a single hex is representative of 50 meters or 50 meters of space squared. And even though fundamentally that you can kind of conceptualize that, I mean, meters are kind of like yards. So if you picture half of a football, or if you picture a portion of a football field, okay, I could see a mech standing there. Okay, I could see. So maybe half a football field is a single movement space. Okay, well, when you're talking about 15, 20, 30 hexes, now it becomes a little bit harder to start imagining that scale. You really, you try, but it's still kind of murky. It's kind of nebulous. And once you introduce combat and weapons whose ranges actually stretch beyond 30 hexes, now it starts to get a little bit overwhelming. So it could require a little bit of legwork, but it's still possible. Minis are great for helping establish or helping clear up what the surroundings look like, as well as the scale of what's going on. I mean, in the video that I showed in the beginning, sure, we could have been playing Mutants and Masterminds, and I could have described Ratmen coming out of there, and I could have said maybe one was up on a truck, and a dozen or so, and a dozen Ratmen start coming out of the hole into the tunnels underneath Manhattan. But even though I say it doesn't, that doesn't really portray necessarily, what numbers look like. I mean, if you're adventurers and you're taking on a whole bunch of enemies, it can really help, sink in, the danger of that situation. If you can actually see, the 20 or so enemies on the board that you're going to be going up against, and that can really, help the drama of the combat there. even though the map and the minis present a clearer image of the surroundings and the scale of the combat, on the flip side of that, it can also slow down your combats because players are now focused on, it becomes a strategy game, and they're really focusing on how to make the best movements and whatnot. And even though smart players will think about that stuff in combat, now it becomes a focus of more on the mechanics and less on my I want my characters to survive. Now they're trying to win as opposed to survive. It creates a disconnect in the immersion in the role playing experience because you're sure this is great. You're presenting a clear image, but it's really, really tempting for the player to slip into the board game mindset, to stop thinking about this in terms of their character and start thinking about or stop thinking of the combat in terms of their character and start thinking about the combat in terms of a player. So now they're trying to win. They're not trying to survive. They're no longer role playing, they're playing a game. And even though role playing is a game, it is, or even though role playing games are games, they are all about the role playing. It's about being a person, or it's about socializing with other people as another person. And when you take away, or and when you start introducing these physical elements, as neat as they are and as fun as they do create a disconnect from that creative space there. That it's the reason why it is the reason why in the debate of whether or not you should use minis in your game, or imagination always comes up. You know, uh, typically the anti mini players will um, will say that it takes away from your imagination, and the pro minis say, well, no, I can still role play with a mini, and both sides are actually right. Yes, it is possible to role play with a mini. You can still talk as your character, and so long as you're careful and keep yourself in the mind of your character, yes, you can do the mini combat and everything without thinking of it as a player, but thinking of it as a character. You know, allowing yourself to say make decisions that you as a player can see, like, because you as a player you're seeing the map from overhead. So if you think of it from a player, you're going to think of it as a strategic standpoint. Oh well, I see that there's a weapon over there on the other side of that barrel that the character doesn't necessarily see and would not even think of that. No, but the player is thinking that. So, oh, I need to move over there. So, oh, and I could also try and flank. Whereas the character's thinking more along the lines of like, there's incoming arrow fire. I need to seek cover. Let's go over here. It is possible to still role play with minis and whatnot, and not allow yourself to think of like combats in terms of player as opposed to the character. And on the other side, yes, it does fundamentally take less imagination when you were running minis to when you were not. That doesn't mean that there's no imagination involved. By all means, if you're role playing with minis and you're able to stay in character and think and act in character, you can still probably see the scene around you. However, fundamentally, that map and those minis are determining how you see that battle carried out. Whereas if you're keeping it completely conceptual without, now every single person at the table has a different or has see that scene, that combat play out completely differently. Now I wouldn't say one or the other is better, but fundamentally, yes, if you use minis, you are using less imagination than you would otherwise, because each player, they don't have to they don't have to imagine the scene as much because you've given them the over. Whereas now they just focus on the details. Whereas before they have to come up with they have to come up with what the entire scene looks like just from your description. Um, if you run without minis, because of that, you have to be good at describing scenes and describing what happens in them. You have to be able to describe surroundings. You have to give a good feeling, a good atmosphere. Otherwise, the players are going to have a very nebulous sort of image of what this setting looks like. But that's also part of being a game master. Minis and maps are aids. they can help a game master who necessarily might not be able to really set a mood in a setting to still create a mood in the setting. It's just a prescribed one. So what it comes down to is a matter of preference and a matter of your skill at describing things as a game master. Um, if as a game master you're not necessarily as good, you realize that one of your weaknesses is setting a mood to a scene or describing the scale and movement of combat to players, then yeah, minis in a map could probably help you out a lot. It'll help your players imagine scenes a lot better, and it'll give you details to build off of that. You can describe the scene and set a mood. There's It's a great resource and players can still role play running minis, but they have to be careful because the temptation is there to think of it as a board game and not as a role playing game. Start thinking of it as a player and not as a character. And on the other side, you can run large scale combats and set specific moods and describe scenes and describe combats um, without using maps and minis. A good or game masters that are good at describing scenes and setting moods and describing the flows of combat can create perfectly fine scenes. And on top of that, it becomes very personalized for each player because each player imagines it differently. Um, so it comes down to what you're comfortable with and what your strengths are when it comes to describing scenes and describing combats. um, for game masters out there who they don't necessarily like minis, but maybe they're having a rough time setting moods or describing settings in combat, portraying a very clear image of for their players. It was recommended to me, and I actually think it's a pretty good idea, is go ahead or don't get like a battle map, something with grid squares and stuff, where the focus can end up getting on the mechanics. Get yourself a nice dry erase board or something that you can use dry erase or wet erase markers on. Something that you can use to sketch out the scene, sketch out that cave or sketch out that warehouse, and get some minis to represent the characters. But leave out grid squares or hex squares. Leave all that out. It's just a sketch of the scene. Here's some barrels. Here's some rocks. Put down the minis for the bad guys and put down the minis for the good guys. That way, as people move around, you know, you can set a scale, but really, you're putting it there more of as a clarity item. You're not putting it there as a mechanical item. So they can picture moving around and stuff, but it stays more lofty and more conceptual than that. My character has to click to every single hex or every single square, and they less worry about the mechanics. Essentially, it keeps it lofty and conceptual, so you're kind of getting that clarity, but without giving them the temptation to think of it as a player as opposed to a character. I personally don't prefer minis. I just feel that they pull too much from the immersion of my games. They pull too much from the role playing aspect. I do use them sometimes. I really only use them when I'm dealing with a large or a complex scale combat. Like the only one in recent memory I can remember was back when I was running a Dark Heresy game, and there came a big climactic battle to this adventure where there were three separate groups all fighting each other, and since each group had like 7 or 8 people in it, it became a lot easier to orchestrate and describe the scene with a layout and some minis. So that's a case of where and even then, I actually, now that I think about it, I didn't use the grid squares then either. I just, drew out the scene and put the minis down, and it really just became more of a clarity item. And really, when it comes to what I would recommend on whether or not you should use minis, I would say if you need them, use them. If you don't need them, I wouldn't recommend using them then. Look at your own skills as a game master. Find your weaknesses, and if you find that you need them, to help clarify your own descriptions, then use them. But absolutely keep the focus off the mechanics and keep it on role playing. This is Our role playing games are not board games. Make sure that your players are thinking or are acting in combat from the perspective of their character and not as a player. All that being said, there's a lot of different aspects to this debate that I may not have touched upon, and you may have disagreed with something I had to say. If you did or you had something to add, please feel free to leave a comment below. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep the conversation going. And as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.